King Charles II of England woke up every morning, opened a small brown box, and rubbed a dark powder all over his body. That powder was a ground-up Egyptian pharaoh. He called it the King's Drops and believed it made him stronger. And here's the thing, he wasn't considered crazy. He was considered ahead of his time. For roughly 5 centuries, the most powerful people in Europe, kings, cardinals, surgeons, philosophers, were consuming mummified Egyptian corpses as medicine. Daily, enthusiastically, with full medical endorsement. And it all traces back to a single translation error so catastrophically stupid that it took half a millennium for anyone to correct it. That error is where we start. Somewhere in ancient Persia, physicians had been using a substance called mumia for centuries. It was natural bitumen, a thick, tar-like mineral that seeped out of mountainside rocks across the Middle East. They applied it to broken bones, open wounds, and infections. It had genuine antiseptic properties. It worked, at least partially. Nobody was eating anyone. Everything was fine. Then European merchants and crusaders arrived in Egypt and noticed something that would ruin the next 500 years of medical history. The mummified bodies of ancient pharaohs were coated in a dark, black, resinous substance that looked almost identical to mumia. A reasonable person would have scraped a sample off the bandages and moved on. Instead, medieval European traders performed what might be the single worst logical leap in recorded history. The resin on the mummy looked like mumia. Mumia was a miracle cure. Therefore, the entire mummy must be the medicine, not the resin. The mummy, all of it. The bones, the skin, the hair, the desiccated organs packed into ceramic jars 3,000 years ago. The whole corpse. One enormous healing capsule. So, European merchants began importing Egyptian bodies by the cartload, grinding them into powder from skull to heel, and selling the dust as the most advanced pharmaceutical product on the market. They weren't trying to practice cannibalism. That distinction, however increasingly hard to defend, was genuinely important to them. In their minds, they were harvesting a mineral. The human shape it came in was simply an inconvenient container. It was, without exaggeration, the most expensive and elaborate way to misread a word in the history of medicine. And the worst part, everyone believed it. Which is where things go from absurd to genuinely out of control. Mummy powder became the hottest health product in Europe. Forget leeches. Forget bloodletting. Forget prayer beads dipped in holy water. Pulverized ancient corpse was the premium wellness solution of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. And absolutely everybody who was anybody was taking it. Picture the scene. A wealthy Parisian merchant wakes up with a splitting headache. His physician arrives, examines him gravely, and prescribes, with total professional confidence, a pinch of powdered pharaoh stirred into a cup of red wine. The merchant drinks it, feels marginally better, almost certainly because of the wine, and recommends it to all his friends. 500 years later, we call that a placebo effect. Back then, they called it cutting-edge medicine. The list of ailments that mummy powder was supposed to cure reads like someone blindfolded a hypochondriac and let them point randomly at a medical encyclopedia. Headaches, mummy powder. Stomach ulcers, mummy powder. Persistent cough, mummy powder. Epilepsy, mummy powder. Nausea, bruising, paralysis, poisoning, broken bones, and general malaise. Mummy powder, mummy powder, mummy powder, mummy powder. It was mixed into wine, dissolved in honey, blended with herbal tinctures, and rubbed directly onto skin, taken before meals, after meals, and apparently instead of meals. Physicians wrote enthusiastic treatises praising its virtues. Apothecaries stocked it on their shelves between the cinnamon and the dried rose petals. It was the multivitamin, the aspirin, and the protein shake of the Renaissance, all rolled into one very ancient, very dead Egyptian. Charles II, the same king from the intro, rubbing pharaoh on his body every morning, also consumed it internally. Francis III of France reportedly carried a small pouch of mummy powder on his person at all times, just in case of emergencies. Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, was a known enthusiast. And then there's Francis Bacon, one of the founding fathers of the scientific method, the man who essentially invented evidence-based reasoning, who wrote about mummy as a legitimate treatment in his medical notes, the father of empirical science, endorsing ground-up corpse. The demand was enormous. The prices were extraordinary. The supply of 3,000-year-old Egyptian pharaohs was, as any reasonable person might anticipate, not unlimited. And that is precisely when someone decided to solve the problem, in a way that makes everything that came before look almost acceptable by comparison. Economics operates without mercy. When demand outpaces supply, someone fills the gap, and in 16th century Egypt, that gap was filled with recently deceased strangers. The authentic mummy trade had been running long enough that the ancient tombs were running dry. Real pharaonic mummies, with their centuries of preservation and aura of mystical antiquity, were becoming genuinely scarce. Egyptian suppliers needed inventory. And so they did what any resourceful merchant would do when facing a product shortage. They manufactured new stock. The method was straightforward, efficient, and deeply foul. They dug up fresh corpses, executed criminals, lepers dead in the street, plague victims, beggars, anyone recently deceased and unlikely to be missed. They packed the bodies with pitch and bitumen, sewed them shut, and left them to dry in the desert sun for several weeks until the exterior looked sufficiently ancient. Then they crated them up, shipped them to Europe labeled as authentic Egyptian mummies, and charged accordingly. European physicians received these counterfeit cadavers, ground them up with the same enthusiasm they'd always applied, and prescribed the powder to their patients without suspicion. For a while, nobody noticed. Powder looks like powder. A body that's been packed with tar and baked in the sun looks more or less like a body that's been packed with resin and preserved for 3 millennia, at least to someone who wasn't looking particularly hard. When the fraud surfaced, and it did surface, through a combination of merchants who talked, traders who confessed, and physicians who began noticing their supposedly ancient mummies smelled distinctly recent, the response across Europe was not philosophical. There was no collective reckoning about the ethics of consuming human remains. No formal medical review. No period of quiet reflection. There was just disgust. Not because people had been eating corpses. They'd been fine with that for 500 years. The horror was precisely, that they'd been eating the wrong corpses. The entire intellectual framework for mummy medicine had depended on these being ancient, transformed, quasi-mystical remains. Bodies so thoroughly changed by time that they had crossed over into something closer to mineral than human. The moment that illusion collapsed, the medicine collapsed with it. The mummy trade ended not with a moral awakening, but with the realization that someone had sold them a sick stranger from last month instead of a magic king from antiquity. That was the line. That was too far. European medicine moved on, and with impressive collective discipline, declined to discuss it further. Mummy powder is not the weirdest thing humans have consumed in the name of medicine. It's not even close. If this convinced you that our ancestors were operating on a completely different level of creative desperation, stick around, because every video on this channel is another entry in that same encyclopedia of spectacular human error. One question for the comments. Are you more disturbed by the fact that they were eating mummies, or by the fact that they stopped only when the mummies turned out to be fake? Pick a side. Nobody ever agrees.